I can't know God's delight fully if I can't feel it in my chest by walking into the room and having other members of Jesus' body say, like, Curt, you're here. And how many of our listeners would ever imagine, let me ask you, like, where would be the rooms that you would walk in and you would predict that that's what they would say? Would you imagine that you walk into the room where the Holy Trinity is hanging out playing cards, they look up and they see you and they say, oh my gosh, you're here. You're here. We can't believe our good fortune that you're here. And it is in this space of faith, of peacemaking, of standing in grace. Grace isn't just a theology. It is a felt sense in my hands, in my face, in my chest that I'm being invited into the house for dinner.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. But you know what would really help us is if you would take a moment right now and send a text and say, hey, I think you should listen to Shifting Culture. Send them your favorite episode, your friends, your family, your network, and just say, this is a great podcast. So thank you so much for doing that. And find us on social media. We're everywhere on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast. You could search, find us. I include a lot of quotes and video clips and other things. It would be great to interact with you there. Previous guests on the show have included Jim Wilder, Jesse Cruikshank, and Craig Westhoff. You could go back, listen to those amazing episodes and more. But today's guest is Curt Thompson. Curt Thompson is a Christian psychiatrist working at the intersection of neuroscience and spiritual formation, and the best-selling author of The Deepest Place. Inspired by deep compassion for others and informed from a Christian perspective, as a psychiatrist, he shares fresh insights and practical applications for developing more authentic relationships and fully experiencing our deepest longing to be known. Through his workshops, speaking engagements, books, organizational consulting, private clinical practice, and other platforms, he helps people process their longings, grief, identity, purpose, perspective of God, and perspective of humanity, inviting them to engage more authentically with their own stories and their relationships. Only then can they feel truly known and connected and live into the meaningful reality they desire to create. Curt and his wife Phyllis live outside of Washington, D.C. and have 2 adult children. In this episode, Curt and I have a great discussion around his book, The Deepest Place. We talk about how secure attachment to God and others can help root and ground us in a place that enables us to move through suffering and find hope. We need to be in loving relationship with one another because we are the embodied presence of Jesus to each other. We have hope because we have a God that came incarnate in the form of Jesus, and he suffered and he died so that he could not just justify us, but so he could be with us in our suffering. Hope is an anticipated future of goodness and beauty. Join us as we walk through suffering and find hope. This is my conversation with Curt Thompson. Curt, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Joshua. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, it's going to be fun talking to you. I would love to really just start with your story of how you started to merge some Jesus and brain science things together. Why these 2 things for you in your life? Why is that important?
It probably began. I mean, there were probably elements of this that were starting even as kind of middle and high schoolers. I'm just being curious about like why do we do what we do? Why do I do what I do? Mostly, it's mostly like what the heck am I like? Why the heck am I doing what I'm doing? And I think then, my story about ending up in psychiatry, I tell people I think that psychiatry found me and not the other way around, in that I had a bit of a mixed relationship with medical school going there, and not completely at ease there once I got there. But psychiatry kind of came in a back door. It was not something that I had anticipated. I wasn't going into medical school looking to become a psychiatrist. Hadn't even crossed my mind as a possibility. But I think that there were these latent longings for me that had to do with how do we know what it means for us to be human, and what does it mean for us to flourish as humans? I mean, I was always asking those questions. And then as a Jesus follower, I mean, I had my own, coming to faith. I grew up in a home of where there were, my parents were both Jesus followers, and I came to faith in what felt to me to be a really prominent way when I was about 13. But immediately also entered into what ended up being about a 20-year long existential crisis that waxed and waned. I'm not alone in that regard. But the whole notion of kind of what does it mean for us to be believers, and then all the things that are going on in the mind were like, they felt like they were right at home with me. And so I think that once I entered into the stream of psychiatry, and I mean, my goodness, I had just really significant mentors along the way, people of faith who were in the field. And then about 20 years ago, when I first encountered Dan Siegel's work and this field of interpersonal neurobiology, that was the time at which this intersection of neuroscience and Christian spiritual formation really began to, I think, start to show up in ways that heretofore it hadn't. Frankly, Joshua, I see all of this as the work of the Holy Spirit creating, bringing opportunities to me when I was ready, over the course of my lifetime. And I've done it quite imperfectly in terms of my response to the Spirit's nudging and moving and so forth. I tell people, look, I'm glad that there are only 10 commandments, because I'd hate to think that there were 15 that I could break every day. I don't realize that idea. But I would say that as it turns out, it is also the case that I think we live at a time in which, in the same way that the scriptures have been translated into multiple different languages, telling the same story over and over and over again, one of the languages I sense and see that we use in our world to navigate our world, and a language that currently has capital and carries weight in the world, as it turns out, is the language of neuroscience. It also happens to be true that language, what we're discovering about neuroscience, like this is the material world of which St. Paul writes about in the first chapter of Romans. From the beginning, the creation has spoken of God's nature and of his power. And I think that this is yet one more language one more dialect that God is using to remind people of what's real and true about the world and the nature of who we are and who Jesus is and what he has done and is doing and where the world is going. And so I'm grateful to be, for my few years that I occupy, that I'm on the earth. I think I tell people I can't believe I get paid to do what I do. I'm grateful and want to steward this particular language that God has given me to speak, so that at the end of the day, people will find that life is more hopeful and more good and more beautiful at the end of the day.
It is hopeful and good and beautiful, but there's also a lot of suffering, and we're going to dive deep how suffering can actually produce that hope in us. And one of the lenses that you use is what you referred to as interpersonal neurobiology. Can you explain that for us? What is that? What is this lens that we're looking through to start to view some of these things?
Well, it's a 2-word fancy smashy phrase that is really trying to encompass a pretty simple concept, and that is that there are a number of different scientific disciplines that all have a stake in understanding the nature of what the mind is and what then is a mind if it's flourishing. To put it as simply as possible, what we're discovering is that the mind isn't just reducible to my brain. It's not reducible just to my thoughts. that my mind has to do with lots of different things that I sense and image and feel and think and do with my body, but it also has a great deal to do with how all of that within me is being shaped by the interactions that I have with you. And so that my mind, what is mine, actually isn't something that I can easily demarcate and say, oh, this all belongs to me and over that belongs to Joshua, even right now. Like, I have a sense of well-being. Why? Well, because I'm looking at you on the screen and you're looking at me with loving kindness. Like, that's you are affecting me and vice versa. And this, what is beautiful about this is that it reflects the biblical narrative, all this, the different ways that we can talk about so many different things in this emerging field. And again, when we are able to talk about mechanics, when we're able to describe, because interpersonal neurobiology, science in general, as we'd like to say, as Michael Polanyi, the famous philosopher of science, once said, there's no such thing as science. There are only scientists. Science doesn't tell us anything. Only people tell us things. And what people tell us about with science, they tell us about the mechanics. They tell us how things work. They don't tell us about the purpose of things. They don't tell us about the good or the bad or the indifferent about things. They just tell us how things work. The beauty of interpersonal neurobiology, in my view, is that it helps us have a sense of mechanics about what our minds are doing. In this, and what does that do for us? In the same way that if you go to a physical therapist who's going to work on your shoulder, and they give you those 23 different exercises that you have to do all day, every day, if they get a mannequin or a skeleton out and they show you exactly what's happening when you do the exercise that they're asking you to do, you are far more likely to do it. And this, in many respects, I think this is what people have reported, that having a sense of the mechanics of the mind gives people a greater sense of agency about how and what they're doing in their relationship with Jesus, which is separate from the mechanics. But the mechanics are kind of all subsumed within that, and grateful to, have a role in being able to help people do that.
So when we're starting to interact one to another, that I'm looking at you, you're looking at me with loving kindness. What does that do to us? What is that? And we talk a little bit, and you talk about attachment. How do we form attachments with each other and with God that'll help us through difficult times?
Right. Well, I think, it's important to know that the mind isn't the only thing in play here. We also live in a particular culture, and this culture that we currently live in, we're at, a particular place in time. And it's a culture that has trained us to believe that I should be able to effectively live in the world by myself. The problem with that is that the brain itself, what we know about the neuroscience tells us, is the brain itself does not live very well in a world in which it believes it's by itself, isolated in a silo. I'm more anxious. I'm more disintegrated. I don't think as clearly. I don't regulate my affect as well. I only do those kinds of things when I have the experience of, as we like to say, every baby comes into the world looking for someone, looking for him, looking for someone, looking for her, in order for me to learn how to regulate all that distress over time through what we would call co-regulation. This is one reason why Trinitarian theology is such a big deal. That Jesus does not come to earth by himself. I do that which I see my Father doing, he says in the Gospel of John. That's what I see myself doing. There's nothing that I do that is not me doing what the Father is doing. And in this way, this attachment process is crucial for us to have some sense of what it means to respond to Jesus. Jesus doesn't just come and give us a set of rules to live by. He comes and says, I want you all to come to me. I think because you're weary, you're heavy laden, like life is a bear. Life is really hard. I'm your guy. And I'm not your guy by virtue of just giving you things to do, telling you how to operate. I want you to come and sense my voice. Look at my face looking at you. The whole notion, when we look at Mark's gospel, and it's the only gospel that gives us this detail in Jesus' interaction with the rich young ruler, where after the conversation, but before Jesus' big comment, he looked at him and loved him. And somehow, the rich young ruler missed the look. He misses the look. This sense that Jesus loves this guy. This guy hasn't chosen to follow him yet. But Jesus said, dude, I want you with me. And this is what attachment is ultimately about. Do I live in a world in which I can sense in my mind, in my experience, in my interaction in my church with other believers, do I have, when I walk in the room, do I have the felt sense of like, dude, we want you with us? To the degree that I am or am not experiencing that felt sense of being wanted, that felt sense of being seen, being soothed, made you feel comfortable and confident, sent on a mission because I'm never going to be alone, to the degree that I sense that in my chest, that's my sense of what it means to be loved by God, and I can return that to God and to my friends as well as my enemies. But to the degree that I don't sense that, you can preach to me until the cows come home about how much God loves me, what God wants me to do, and looking at the Sermon on the Mount and so forth and so on. And it will be difficult for me to do that if I'm not having a felt sense of attachment to God that I actually develop most powerfully through my attachments to other human beings.
So we are the embodied presence of Jesus one to another. How do we start to enter into being embodied presence?
Right.
What does that look like in community?
Well, I mean, I think, again, we live in a culture in which we think that somehow we should be effectively formed by going to church for an hour on Sunday, going to a small group once a week, maybe, praying, reading my Bible for 10 minutes, and when you think about the amount of time that you then spend in the world that is forming you very differently, how is it that it should be no surprise to us when we discover that our lives do not feel very robustly like Jesus. And this is not because we're stupid or we're just not, working hard, but there it does involve this question of, to what degree am I being known deeply by other followers of Jesus, such that the parts of me that are not yet ready to follow Jesus, that are the parts of me that are like that father in Mark chapter 9, I believe, help thou my unbelief, help the parts of me that aren't on board, that are still afraid. How will I know what those parts are if I'm not in a community by whom I'm being deeply known, such that I can say, oh, right, there is this part of me in my life that still believes that God is a tyrant. What are we going to do about that part? Well, I'm not going to do much if I don't know that he's there, because I'm not in a situation in which I can be deeply known enough. And so when we read the stories of the Gospels, Jesus wasn't just having people hang out with him in order for him to teach them principles. I mean, he could have written a couple of documents and sent that around to people. It would have maybe been a lot safer. But what he was doing, he's actually, when he says, again, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, take my yoke upon me, learn from me, for I am meek and lowly. Learn from me. Not just learn data from me. Learn by, what's it like for you when you sense me talking to the prostitute, when that's not like your cup of tea? What's that like? What do you feel? What's happening for you right here and now? These are real-time, real embodied experiences. And this becomes the primary crucible. The body of Jesus is the primary crucible in which we are formed. Notice, Paul had all kinds of language that he could have used. Jesus didn't say, y'all are my society. He said, this is my body, this is my blood. He doesn't say, oh, this is just a symbol of the general act of justification that I'm about to commit. This is a theological term. These are real things. When Paul had all kinds of other words he could have used when he talks about the body of Christ. But that body, that the Romans at the time, it was just utilitarian. It was expendable. I could do with your body whatever I wanted to if I was a Roman citizen. And Paul takes that and elevates it, and at the same time is saying, the body of Jesus, you are his hands and feet, but you are that to each other. But it also means you're to do that in such a way that you create space for us to be confessional, space for us to talk about our suffering, to suffer together, such that the suffering together enables the suffering itself to be transformed.
Well, to suffer is to be human. To be human
Right.
is to suffer.
Yeah.
So what is suffering for you, and how does that start to form us and give us hope?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are some technical ways to talk about that. In our field, when we study these kinds of things, we would say suffering is my experience, my subjective encounter with pain over time. And by subjective, I mean my sense that it could be an emotional sense of pain. It could be a physical sense of pain. I could have rheumatoid arthritis that just simply won't let me function very well. I could have cancer. I could have any number of different physical maladies. I could have been in a car accident in which I'm now a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, or I'm dying of ALS. At the same time, we have all kinds of suffering that takes place in the context of our own interior lives, much of which we're not even aware of because we're working so hard to keep ourselves disconnected from it. And much of which, too, because we are, here we are in the West, and, we have lots of accessories. I have lots of accessories that I use to distract myself from my suffering. My friend Pepper Sweeney and I were recently in El Salvador, and we were with Compassion International, and we were with people whose lives are very different than ours, and whose lives, and who, any number of people would say to us that the church and their life with Jesus was the difference between life and death for them. They don't have the kind of accessories that I do that will protect them from their suffering. And so what's beautiful about pulling the curtain back on our suffering is that it finally allows others to see it, allows me to see it, and to know that you are not leaving the room, and that I can stop burning all that energy trying to contain it and begin to allow my experience of it to create within me an even greater and more deeply felt sense of being loved, which of course is not what we imagine suffering to do.
My wife and I were in the Middle East for a while and worked with refugees and out of the Syrian war, Syrian refugees. And there was a lot of suffering and trauma that they have gone through. And it shocked me when I heard from one of our friends said, I thank God for this war. I thank God that I actually had to move countries because I met Jesus and I met you. And I now feel that I am loved. And it's shocking that saying, thank God for this suffering because now I feel loved. And it's really hard, I think, for us when we're sitting there and I'm trying to hold space for people who have gone through suffering and trauma. And I know that I haven't gone through that specific suffering. I've had other suffering. How can we hold space for one another without comparing our sufferings that bring us to a place of loving attachment to each other?
Well, the practice of comparison is as old as Cain and Abel. And Cain is essentially comparing God's response to him and his response to Abel. And Cain, to a certain degree, is suffering. There's a certain suffering that he's having to endure. Somehow, the firstborn, Cain, his sacrifice was not received as quickly. But also somehow, Cain misses God's comment to him when God says, because Cain's upset and so forth, and God then says, why are you downcast? If you do well, if you do good, will to your countenance not be elevated? Will you also not be honored? Like there's this sense in which I'm comparing myself. And so we might say that anytime I'm comparing myself to someone else, even when I would say, oh, my suffering is just not clearly they are suffering, I'm not suffering, my suffering doesn't deserve. The moment I do that, I am choosing to not pay attention to what is true for me. And it already reveals kind of a bit of a misunderstanding of my own life. That in and of itself, that comparison makes it possible for me not to actually look at through the windows and doors into my own soul and to discover, gosh, maybe there are things there that I do suffer from, but I've worked really hard not to pay attention to it. And I'm so effective at it that I only perceive now that how could my suffering be as bad as anybody else? It just simply isn't. And so I don't do anything about it. And that makes it that much more difficult for me to actually truly be empathic with other people's suffering. And so I only can begin to be truly connected to someone else when I have allowed myself to be truly seen first by somebody to begin with. Where I'm willing to answer the question when you put the question to me, well, Curt, tell me where you suffer. I'm like, Joshua, I'm looking around like, I don't suffer. There's something already that would be, a red flag to you to say, How is it Curt isn't aware? I mean, my goodness, like he needs Jesus. How is it that he's not aware of where he's up? That raises some questions about my degree of blindness to things. But to the degree that I can actually name it for where it is without comparison, it enables me to then be much more deeply connected to the real pain that someone else has. Because, as we like to say, like those things that we suffer, remember, suffering is pain over time. And suffering becomes suffering because of the story that I tell about my pain. Suffering isn't just this independent thing that happens without my cooperation. It has to do with the story that I'm telling about myself and my experience of pain. And so if I'm telling myself, I can't look at my pain, I can't imagine my pain, I don't want to pay attention to my pain's not that important, that in and of itself will contribute to ongoing suffering that I have that I then double down and pay no attention to, which at the end of the day makes me less effectively able to be present for other people. And so to the degree that I am allowing others in the body of Jesus to invite me into my own story, where I can be really curious about what are the things about my story where I suffer without comparison, that then enables me with humility to be present with those whose lives appear on the surface to be so much more tragic and those whose lives appear to be so much less tragic. Because otherwise, we get right back to the rich young ruler where, of course, he leaves and the disciples say, like, dude, like if that, and Jesus says, how difficult is it for people who are wealthy to get into the kingdom of heaven? And they say, well, gosh, if he can't get in, how are we going to get in? If this cat who isn't suffering can't get in. And I think the point would be Jesus might say, what makes you think he's not suffering? Like that dude didn't even see my look of love. Like there's a problem there.
If we want to sit in our suffering, and I think telling the stories that we tell ourselves, we're telling ourselves stories of our own suffering. How can we start to tell a new story, a different story because we perpetually tell ourselves the same thing over and over again.
Right. Well, we talk about suffering as being a function of one of three different things. We suffer because of things that have happened to us and genuinely have. I got T-boned in the intersection and I lost the use of my lower body, right? It happened to me. And there are lots of things that are true about that. However, the second way that we suffer is probably far and away the most common reason, and that is we suffer because of things that we do to ourselves. And that has everything to do with the story that I tell about myself over the amount of time that I tell that story about myself. The third reason that we suffer is because we are running as hard as we can toward the light. Jesus said, come and pick up your cross. He didn't say, come and pick up your Tesla and drive alongside me. There is a certain sense in which I'm always struck and reminded of the story of Eustace in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in which Eustace, after having stolen the dragon's gold, becomes the dragon, and then he is so miserable and he finds himself at this reflecting pool, and then there is this huge lion that shows up. And I love Lewis's language when the lion says to him, "May I undress you?" And Eustace allows the lion with his claws to peel layer after layer after layer of scales. And with every layer that is peeled, there is a suffering. There is a painful process that continues layer after layer. And I'm thinking like, oh, this feels like me. Layer after layer. There is a sense in which Jesus is really serious about peeling off, putting to death all those parts of me that put on to protect myself from myself and from him. And to run toward the light, to allow the lion to undress us, such that we may be whole and clean, is a painful process. There is a certain suffering that happens in that. And so this is what we mean when we say, if we aren't suffering even in that way, then it's probably worth considering and asking the question, where in my life has Jesus been trying to get my attention that I have been unwilling to let him go? And so then what this means is that once we identify this in the presence of others who are going to be present with us fully in our pain, we allow ourselves, perhaps for the very first time. I mean, I'm struck by what you were saying earlier about about the person who says like their posture toward the war and toward what it then meant for them to come to have this sense, this suffering leads to being loved in a way like they'd never been loved. And it is that we are paying attention to. One would have loved and been struck by to have heard Job's friends say to him, dude, like this is way above our pay grade to know like why you got boils all over your carcass. We don't understand that, but we just know we're not leaving the room. This is really hard, and we feel how hard this is. We're sorry that we can't come up with all the right words to say, but like we just want you to know we're not leaving the room. Can you imagine Job? He's with friends who don't require him to figure it out, don't require him to have an answer to the question, what did you do or not do enough of such that you were suffering in this way? They're just willing to say, we love you and we're with you. We don't even understand it, but we are with you. We understand that. We're going to be present for you. And this whole notion, Joshua, of atonement, this notion of at-one-ment, Jesus entering into our suffering, not just to be the actor of justification from a legal standpoint, but to be the one who is fully with us in ways that we can't even, I'm not even comfortable yet being with myself. That transforms my suffering because it changes and shifts how I'm paying attention to myself and to the notion of what it means to be loved in the middle of my pain. That sense of being loved, that sense of the presence of someone not leaving the room, draws my attention to him far more frequently than simply to my pain. What we know is that on this side of the new heaven and earth, this does not guarantee that my pain goes away. This does not guarantee that my suffering ends. But what it does is that it transforms our interpretation of our suffering. And the suffering itself becomes God's agent, even though evil would have wanted to use it to devour us. My brother, who was 16 years my senior, died around Christmas 19 years ago after having lived with pancreatic cancer for 3 years. And I have 3 brothers, all 3 of whom have died from cancer. And I remember when Jim, it was toward the end. And this was a man who over 3 years I watched be utterly transformed by Jesus. I watched a man even meet Jesus in a way that he never had. I watched his relationships with his wife, with his kids, with his friends be transformed. I watched his relationship with me be transformed. And I'll never forget when he said, I wouldn't wish cancer on my worst enemy. And I can honestly say, I'm not sorry this has happened to me. And it is in that suffering that light poured in. Now, it's true that my brother didn't have to have that posture. I mean, he could have had a very different response to that. He could have had a response of resentment and ingratitude and contempt and cursing, and that was not his response. What happened to him became transformational for other people who were in his orbit, other people who saw what it meant for my brother Jim to be transformed in the way that he was. And it's only the Christian story, Joshua, that takes suffering and does with it what it does.
Yeah. It is the most phenomenal, incredible thing that Jesus is with us in our suffering, that he suffered and died on a torture machine. A God that came incarnate to be with us in all things, in all ways. It's the most phenomenal, incredible things. I've been thinking about the cross lately, and I've just been tearing up.
Yeah.
Been getting to this place of how in the world can a God do that for us and be with us in that way? So how do we get to that place where we know that Jesus is with us, that his embodied presence is with us in it, and we don't just know it intellectually?
Well, in the book that we're talking about, The book we in the book we explore the first 5 verses of the 5th chapter of Romans, and one of the things I invite our listeners and or readers in the book to consider is that the world can look at suffering and say it's just a horrible thing, and the East and the West have metaphysics that address that ultimately in both cases want to find ways for it to go away, and we don't have any category in which there's anything about it that is redeemable or redeeming any of that. But when we read those 5 verses in Romans chapter 5, we see that before we get to that famous verse of suffering produces perseverance, produces character, produces hope that does not put us to shame, before we get there, there is an on-ramp. We don't just start with suffering. In the same way that it's easy for us, and this happens in some of our traditions when we start to talk about the human condition in the gospel. And so when we begin as if the Bible begins in Genesis chapter 3. As if it begins, the story of us begin with us, blowing things in the garden. It forgets that that's not where the story begins, that the story begins actually at the beginning, in which God has not forgotten his mission to turn us into rulers, queens and kings on this earth. And in the same way, Paul, echoing those first 2 chapters of Genesis, starts with this notion of trust, with faith. That we have peace with God, that we are bound, that we are imagining God's glory, God's delight in us, God's utter, not just brilliance, but his utter delight in having us be part of this story. And I can't come up with that stuff as simply theological ideas. The way I come to understand that faith has some substance to it is if I have a relationship of trust that I develop with real human beings in the body of Jesus. I can't know God's delight fully if I can't feel it in my chest by walking into the room and having other members of Jesus' body say, Curt, you're here. And how many of our listeners would ever imagine, let me ask you, where would be the rooms that you would walk in and you would predict that that's what they would say? Would you imagine that you walk into the room where the Holy Trinity is hanging out playing cards, they look up and they see you and they say, oh my gosh, you're here. You're here. We can't believe our good fortune that you're here. And it is in this space of faith, of peacemaking, of standing in grace. Grace isn't just a theology. It is a felt sense in my hands, in my face, in my chest that I'm being invited into the house for dinner. And this doesn't happen first in my head as an abstract idea. It happens in somebody's kitchen. And as this becomes, this is what was taking place in the early church. This is what was taking place in the book of Acts. Jesus, the Spirit is he's all over the place with human bodies. And as we are committing ourselves to do this in our communities, we create the groundwork wherein which, when we bring our suffering into the room, the suffering is already being shaped by my memory of having heard your voice, seen your sight lines, felt your embrace, when I've already had the memory of repairing ruptures with other members, forgiving sin. When we make mistakes, we correct that. The whole notion of I'm going to be praying for the people that I don't like, that are sitting in the pew right next to me. Those kinds of real embodied actions are the ones that most powerfully set us up and prime us and prepare us for what it means to then have our suffering transformed. Because it's going to happen in these kinds of contexts where it's not just an abstract theology, but it's something that I feel in my heart rate and my blood pressure as much as anywhere else.
No, my mother-in-law just went into hospice about 6 weeks ago, and she lives with us. My wife is now her primary caregiver, and I'm thinking, there is suffering. There's a lot of difficult things to be a caregiver of somebody who is slowly going away and is going to be with Jesus soon.
Yeah.
But when she first had a big decline, we were in a space with followers of Jesus that loved us well. In the middle of that, our church people in our church have been the most kind and gracious and loving and being present with us that I've ever experienced and ever seen. It's different than it was when we've had sufferings in the past. We feel more loved and supported. We feel like there is some hope in this. And I wouldn't have said that, 2 months ago. I didn't think it would be possible that we could find some of this hope in the midst of a really hard, difficult thing where, my 6-year-old son has only known his grandmother in the house all of his life, and now he is going to have to say goodbye to her at such a young age. So I'm just thankful for the body of Christ.
Yeah.
In the midst of this.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the word hope, because I think this is the other thing that we're talking about. This notion that most of the time when we think about suffering, we only think about something that is bad, and hope is not a word that we include as part of the conversation when we think about suffering. I wouldn't say like, if you start with suffering, where would you think you're going to end up? Most of us are going to say, I think I'm going to end up with hope. Like, nah, that doesn't really compute in our world. But the example that you just given, what is so beautiful about that is that it is a shining example of how neurobiology works. Because the whole notion of hope, when we talk about it, first of all, we often talk about hope as a thing that we hope happens to us. Like, it's just a thing that's going to, I hope I get to be hopeful. And I expect that my hope is going to emerge as a function of things that happen to me that are actually beyond my agency. Like, all these circumstances are going to align, and then I can be hopeful because of something else that happens that I can't control. But what the scriptures are actually teaching, they actually teach that hope is a thing that we form. It is a thing for which we have agency to develop. It does not happen only because of something that happens to me from outside my skin. And so, for instance, how does that work? Well, we know that we like to say that as far as the brain is concerned, we remember our future. What do we mean by that? My brain is, as one way that we like to talk about the brain is that it's one big anticipation machine. I am always wondering what's coming next. I stand up from my desk when we're done. I'm going to walk outside of my office door, walk down the steps, and I am going to anticipate that the steps and the stairs, they're going to hold. The banister's going to hold. Now, I'm not thinking this to myself. Well, I might now that we're talking about it, right? But I'm not typically thinking these things. I'm not typically thinking, I hope that the key turns the car on. No, I just put it in, and I'm living, anticipating certain things happening. But the reason that I anticipate that is because I've had dozens and dozens and dozens of experiences in which this has happened. And so I have an experience that I embed in my neural networks of memory. And those remembered events become the groundwork for what I anticipate my future to be. This is why we say we remember our futures. This is important because if I have lots of experiences of trauma that are not resolved, if I have lots of experiences in which I've had unrepaired ruptures, especially with parents or older siblings or whatever, it will be difficult for me to imagine a hopeful future with God. But if I am, in your stories you just described, if I'm having experiences in which, in the middle of our travail, I'm being loved, okay, there's a memory. And then there's another memory the next day, and another memory the next day, and so forth and so on. I began to collect a whole library of remembered experience that becomes the bulwark out of which I anticipate my future. My hope is an anticipated future of goodness and beauty. That's what it is. But I can only anticipate the things that I'm remembering. And if I have the memory of being loved in the middle of pain, such that the pain itself is transformed by the presence of others who are not leaving the room, and that is all in the context of resurrection. They're doing this because they hope, like I hope, in the resurrection. These acts right here and now become outposts, a foretelling of the resurrection that's coming. And so even in my pain, I have the sense of being comforted. This becomes something that I anticipate in its ultimate form in the future. And so the hope that I have for a new body circles back around even into my present moment to fuel what's happening even now in this cycle that takes place, such that I remember my future of hope because of the collected events in which I'm embedding what it means for me to be loved in the middle of my pain now.
If you could tell the listeners one or two things that could help form that hope in us, we've talked about a lot of them, but just highlight a couple of them for us.
Right. Well, I think that, the brain is highly primed to pay attention to danger and things that we anticipate will be frightening. And the reason the reason it's primed to do that is because we're primed to pay attention to the things that like worry us, put us in danger. And so one of the things that I would say that can prime us for hope is, this is a simple thing: daily keep a gratitude journal. Make a list of three things a day that you can be grateful for. But beyond that, I don't just want you to be listing the gratitude items. I want you to, I would love for you to write out, I'm really grateful for Joshua because I had a lovely conversation with him today. They could write that. They could write, I'm really grateful for Joshua. That's not enough. What I would want your listener to do who's had their conversation with you, I would like to say, I want you to describe where you and Joshua were. I want you to describe for me, what was something that Joshua said to you, and what did you feel, and where did you feel it? I want you to practice embedding the memory of having been seen by him. I want you to practice this. When Jesus says that he wants you to remember me, do this in remembrance of me at the Last Supper, he's not just saying, oh, this is an act of, that just a ritual that you repeat. In remembrance, meaning you're remembering what I've said, you're remembering how I've said it, you're remembering what it was like to be with me, you remember the felt sense of my hands on your back when I held you in an embrace, the laughter that we shared when we made fun of Peter and he got it and we were all okay. Like all these things, we want to pay attention to the things that we are grateful for. And especially, I want you to pay attention to what you sense and image and feel in your body that enabled you to know that you were being loved, especially in those moments where your pain felt significant. So that what you're doing is you are literally stitching together neural networks that are ones of joy and well-being. They're being stitched together to speak to complement, to touch, to neurobiologically shape and form what your neural networks are of suffering, such that you are beginning to tell a different story about your pain, even though your pain itself does not go away. These are concrete things that take time, they take effort, but these are the way that we are formed. This is the way that we practice perseverance, for example. This is the next word, right? We persevere. We are going to practice paying attention to the beauty and goodness that I experience so that it's not just something that happened over this past month as I've been with my mother-in-law and she's dying. It's a thing that I'm going to practice embedding. I'm going to take this with me. These are all important things. We live in a world in which we'd like to believe, especially again when it comes to church, like I can listen to a sermon and somehow that's going to magically transform me. And like the news is not good for preachers. You preach a 30-minute sermon, I can tell you, at best, unless a person has recorded it and go home and study it like they're studying for a history exam the next day, at best 3 minutes tops is what they will remember. And so we want people who are willing to do the work. This is what Jesus is asking for. Like I want serious followers who are willing to do the work of actually believing that I love them, which means you're going to have to practice looking for the look.
Curt, I think that's the most helpful thing when it comes to gratitude that I've ever heard. Because people enter in and say, keep a gratitude journal, be thankful, give God your gratitude. But the way that you embedded it within memory and that it actually then attaches to other things that will start to change you. I think it's one of the most helpful things I've ever heard of gratitude. So thank you for that.
Yeah. You're welcome.
I'm just excited for the people listening, and I'm excited for myself too, because I think that's going to change the way that I interact in the world and interact with God. So
Yeah. Well, here's something else they can do if they would like. Just hopping onto the gratitude thing. I mean, it's a simple thing. It is a simple practice. It is a simple practice. But I will tell you, Joshua, the first thing our listeners are they're going to hear this and they're going to think like, Thompson is a whack job. Okay, I'm just going to tell them. But here is a thing to do that also that is about gratitude. It uses gratitude, but it is also about constructing hope. How many times does someone say to us, "Hey, thanks so much for doing X, Y, and Z. Hey, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Whatever." Sometimes we say to someone, "Thank you for that." And if we've been raised as, to be polite creatures, it's fairly automatic. Hopefully by the time our kids are 19 years of age, they've learned this. And so, say, hey, thanks a lot. And so you're welcome. Or if you're in Chick-fil-A, my pleasure, right? We're all like, this is what we do. And we would notice it we notice it when someone doesn't say thank you. And if I say thank you, I notice it if somebody doesn't respond, you're welcome. I notice it. But here's something that would help people notice things even more. And here's how it goes. The next time someone thanks you for something that is relatively not trivial, the next time someone thanks you, here's what you do. They say, "Hey, thanks so much for letting me use your car." And you say, "Okay, wait a minute. Can you just hold up for a second?" And you're like, "Okay, what?" "Well, I just want to take in your gratitude." And you give yourself 5 to 10 seconds and you're just taking in their gratitude. And of course, they're looking around and they're thinking, this is already where they're thinking like, this is weird. But here I am, Joshua, and I'm taking in my friend's gratitude. I just want to take it in because I'm really grateful for your expression of thanks. And like, you're not just putting on a show for them. Like, you literally are remembering that they have thanked you. They have made a bid for intimacy. They have connected with you. Now, here's the kicker. It's also equally true that we often say thank you to all kinds of people, and we do it because it's automatic behavior, and we think it's a good and right thing to do. But we don't really have the sense that my thank you is landing in such a way that would be transformational for anybody. But if you were to say thank you, "Hey, thanks for letting me borrow your car," and they were to say, "Hey, hang on just a second. I just want to take in your gratitude," and I'm now the one who's looking around thinking, this is weird. When's the last time any of us have had the experience of our gratitude, expressed as it is automatically, honored? And in this process, what we're doing, Joshua, is that I'm not just giving you my thanks, I'm giving you me. And vice versa. When you're receiving it, you're letting me know that I've been received. And it's these kinds of acts. When someone's suffering, I know many situations in which people are suffering and they're like, "No, I don't want anybody to see me. I don't want anybody." I would want, if that person is listening, I would want you to know there's never been a greater opportunity for both you and for others to be gifted with being loved than for you to allow others to be present with you in your suffering. But this takes great courage because, what evil wants to do, evil wants to use suffering as a way to extend and deepen and thicken our sense of being disconnected from God and from others. And Paul is saying, no. Paul's saying it with the gospel. With the gospel. That's not the way this is going to happen.
Yeah, that's a beautiful place to end. But I do have 2 quick questions that I like to ask at the end.
Yeah.
I like to ask people, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
There might be additional things that I think I would probably say, but here's one thing I would say. I would say you're going to make choices over the course of your lifetime, and you're going to be doing the best you can when you make them. And later, you're going to be tempted to think that you're going to be tempted. You're going to look back and you're going to wish that you'd made different choices. But not only that, you're going to be tempted to be really, really hard on yourself. You're going to be tempted to create suffering for yourself in a way that Jesus does not want to have happen. So I want you to know that whatever the choices are that you're making, in which you're doing the best that you can, I want you to know that Jesus is with you in all of it. And there's not a moment of your decision making that he's going to turn around 10, 20, 30, 40 years later and say, what the heck were you doing? And so I want you to be alert to this and be aware such that you choose not to be hard on yourself as you age and discover that there were parts of you that would have done things differently, to which we would say, it's true. And now we've learned some things in order for you to become wiser. But I want to protect you from the parts of you that will want to bludgeon you to death for not having done everything perfectly.
That's good. That's really good advice. Anything you've been reading or watching you could recommend?
Well, yeah, I tell people for the last couple of years, my two audiovisual pillars of spiritual formation have been The Chosen. I'm like on season, I'm like the fifth time through all three of those seasons. And the Bible Project is just a great enterprise that Tim Mackey and John Collins have. We could go on and on about the Bible Project. I think that they're just doing phenomenal work. And but I would also say that a book that continues to bear fruit for me is a book that came out in 2019 that is called Dominion by Tom Holland. He's a British author of antiquity, and he's not a believer. It's not a small read, but it's a great read. And he's not a believer, and I would say it is one of the most hope-filled books about my experience with Jesus that I have read in many, many years, which I find, even as I say that repeatedly, I've said this to people, the fact that it's written by a person who's not a person of faith, I think is a testimony to the work of the Holy Spirit in all things.
Yeah, that's great. Good recommendations. Curt, your book, The Deepest Place, I think is very beautiful. It's helpful for so many people to find hope in the place of suffering. So I really encourage people to go out and get the book. It's fantastic. I loved it. I read it and I listened to the audiobook. So I've done both, and they were both really good. But where would you like to point people to? How can people connect with you, what you're doing?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is, we'll get to kind of social media things, but the first thing I would, for people who want to hear more about the work that I'm doing, the easiest access point is through the Being Known podcast. My friend Pepper Sweeney and I co-host that along with Amy Chella, who's one of our producers. And I've loved doing that, and it unpacks a lot of the stuff. It's just about all the work that I do. So the Being Known podcast that you can find on whatever platform that you use for that. You can also find my work through just my website, CurtThompsonMD.com. You can find me on Instagram and I guess what used to be Twitter and Facebook. And then the other thing, we do a lot of work training people through confessional communities that we talk a little bit about in The Deepest Place. And that's through our work at New Story Behavioral Health here in Northern Virginia, which is the private practice that I'm part of. So those are all places, resources to find about my work. So and I'm just really grateful to have had the chance to be with you. This has been lovely.
Well, thank you, Curt. It was a fantastic conversation to help us enter into a place where we could have some secure attachments that would be attached to one another as we are seeing the embodied presence of Jesus in the face of other believers, so that we could transform our suffering into a place of hope, even though the pain may not go away, but we could still have hope in the midst of it, and so that we could be grateful that Jesus is with us and he has suffered with us. And so thank you for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed talking to you.
You're most welcome. It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Joshua.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.